Drive sober.
You're watching Rogers TV.
Maureen Cassidy is an old friend of the show. In fact, she was one of the very first guests that we had, and then we had her again, and then we had her again, and then at the beginning of this second season, we've had her again. So this is awesome. I appreciate you coming, Maureen. Maureen Cassidy's a former city councillor who has now migrated over to being the CEO of Pillar Nonprofit. She came by that quite honestly. I know you were filling a temporary role there to begin with as Pillar was sorting through its new future. But you and I served together on the mayor's panel on poverty a number of years ago, and I saw the aptitude that you had for working with nonprofits and charities and the service sector within the city, that you really had a care for that as a politician at that point. And I since come to learn that that's a lot of where your heart is at anyway, Maureen. So I think it's awesome that you're a Pillar. I think you've helped them to navigate some difficult waters. So many groups are doing that right now. It's not easy. It's not been an easy time, but I think it's great that you're there. Now, you just recently had an AGM, and I know the mayor addressed the AGM, and if you don't mind, I just want to read what he said. He talked about his idea of a multi-year budget and what he wanted to do, but then he said this: one of the visions I have for that budget process is that the organization of Pillar, on behalf of nonprofits, will be intimately involved in the development of that new economic strategy, because not-for-profits need to rightly take their place and recognition in the city as significant contributors to the economic prosperity of the City of London. That's great, and I appreciate Josh Morgan saying it. I did have two questions for you, though, that relate to that. I once wrote an article for the Free Press on behalf of Pillar a few years ago, calling on governments to be more dedicated towards the nonprofit sector. There was great frustration at that time that governments were piecemeal. It was all over the place, and it was difficult for nonprofits to navigate into that future. They knew they were significant partners in every community, but they were having trouble getting governments to focus. I understand that the mayor has said this about Pillar, but I also understand that as someone who's involved in things like food security or other things, that often words are said and frequently it doesn't come together because there's so many different parts. And that's also true in a city structure. So many different divisions and departments and department heads, and then the political side weighing in on that. As Mayor Morgan said that, and you were sitting there, and I know you addressed the place as well, did you feel you maybe rounded a corner there? Because I know it's not been an easy time since the pandemic, but what was your feeling listening to that?
Yeah, rounded a corner. It felt like, so a number of things had happened leading up to that moment at our AGM. So we did put forward a business case with the city's multi-year budget that was just finalized the last few months. And our business case was not taken up by City Council, so the ask of Pillar was not included in their multi-year budget. But leading up to that decision by Council, I had a number of meetings with different members of Council, many of the members of Council, including the Mayor. And I had a formal meeting with the Mayor, and I had a couple of informal conversations with him. So in my conversations directly with the mayor, he did mention that he would be working on this overarching economic development plan and this strategy. And he wanted Scott Mather, the deputy city manager in that area in planning and economic development. He wanted him to take the lead on developing this plan. And in our private meetings, he did say that he would expect that Pillar would have a role to play in the development stage at the very least of that plan. We really did push in our business case and in our lobbying and advocacy efforts with City Council. We did push the importance of the nonprofit sector to the economy of the City of London. It's a sector that's important across the country, and not just economically, but because City councillors can be very focused on numbers, especially at budget time. The economic side of things is something that was really necessary to push, because if they're going to make an investment in Pillar, the organization, in the nonprofit sector more broadly, then you have to show them that they're going to get return on their investment. I had a couple of councillors push back and say, we shouldn't necessarily be investing in the nonprofit sector. And my response was, you already are. You're already investing in the nonprofit sector. So what Pillar does in building capacity in that sector, and by building capacity is a broad term, the kinds of training that we do, the kinds of leadership training, and especially board governance training, leads to the stronger foundation in the individual organizations that are taking that training, which leads to a stronger nonprofit sector across the board. So if you're going to invest money in the nonprofit sector, you want to make sure you have individual organizations that have a strong foundation. So they're not going to fall apart, and as they fall apart, take that city money with them. You want to give them a stronger chance of being able to deliver the way that the city wants them to deliver. Yeah. So hearing the mayor say those words, that not just what he had said publicly in the past was that they expect the nonprofit sector to be at the table when they develop that plan. So at our AGM, he made it very clear that he wants Pillar to be there on behalf of the nonprofit sector. I'm sure they will reach out. I hope that they will reach out to other agencies when they're developing that plan, like the London Food Bank, and bigger organizations like the United Way and things like that. But Pillar as an organization represents those smaller organizations that might not always have a voice at the policy table. Yeah. So it's important that we're there representing the sector broadly.
Yes, I mean, I just finished an interview a few weeks ago with Mike Savage, who's the mayor of Halifax. Now, he's finished 3 terms, and he's announced he won't be running for a 4th. And then I just finished interviewing Naheed Nenshi, the former mayor of Calgary. He'll be on Food Bites in another week or so. But they both said the same thing, that, cities have a difficult time kind of working out the movement with nonprofits, because traditionally there has been a kind of gap between the two. They are aware of one another's existence. But the problem now is cities have the least resources of any level of government. So they're running out of those resources. Provinces and the feds can sometimes squeeze them, especially in economic challenging times. So it leaves the city with fewer choices. And one would think that if the city has fewer choices, that it would close that gap between itself and the nonprofit sector, because it really needs it for not only the delivery of services, but expertise, as you said, like board training and other things. And I'm interested in this because a lot of the nonprofits are involved in food in one way or another, and they have really come through for the city in this last few years. Big and small, they've really come through because the city has not had the resources that were necessary to provide the food security. So I think it would make sense to me, and I'm glad that the mayor used those words, that Josh Morgan used those words. But I still think there's a hesitancy, at least if I listen to other mayors, there's still this hesitancy to close this kind of historic cultural gap that exists between government and not-for-profit. So I think that's stuff. I have a second question for you, though. I asked you about the governmental side of things when Mayor Morgan spoke, and how things can often be all over the map. That's also true for the nonprofit sector, the not-for-profit sector. I mean, you are there in Pillar, and part of the goal, and I know because you've told me this before, is to try to draw all of those players together once more, if they were ever fully together in the first place. And I think that's a really important thing to say as well. The nonprofit sector itself has often had difficulty organizing. And if it wasn't for groups like Pillar, I'm not sure who's going to be out there doing that. So Pillar is really essential. But as you listened to what the mayor said and as you went through your AGM, did you feel within the not-for-profit or nonprofit sector that ability to cohesively come together is there? Is it there more than it was, say, before the pandemic?
Before the pandemic, I'm not sure. So we're at an interesting time in our own personal history at Pillar too. So the difference in the feeling in the room this year at our most recent AGM last week was the difference was palpable compared to 2023. We had just come through a period of significant change and transition at Pillar. Some level of precarity that I'm not sure the organization had experienced in recent history, even during the pandemic. Well, a lot of the stuff that sort of came to a head in 2022 is related to the stuff that went on during the pandemic. So everything sort of came to a boil and it all exploded all at once. So there was a great deal of hope, optimism. Our treasurer, who's very adept and real talk, no sugarcoating. Somebody came to me afterwards. We had multiple responses about how good the treasurer's report was this year. And somebody in the nonprofit sector, one of our organizations who's a member, came to me and said that was the best treasurer's report at an AGM she has ever seen. And our treasurer used the words optimistic in her report. This is with still ending 2023 in a deficit position. This is with our auditor still including a going concern clause in our audit. But even with that, they sort of they softened it a bit this year compared to the audit from the previous year. So the atmosphere in the room. We had 100 people registered for our annual general meeting. More than 80 people actually showed up, which is amazing, because a lot of times people register and don't show up. So the people that didn't come, that had registered, it wasn't a lot. It was an incredible day. It was an incredible meeting, and staff really felt it too. So you saw people almost walking on air. So what does that mean for Pillar and our ability to play that role? The founding fathers of Pillar, as you sort of touched on, was that Pillar. There are three pillars in our society. There is the nonprofit pillar. There is the pillar that is represented by the public sector or the government sector. And then there is the private sector or the business community. And that the nonprofit sector should be that middle column that brings all three together. Because the biggest, as you know, this sort of, touches on how we saw our work on the Mayor's Advisory Panel on Poverty. The only way that our society can solve those really wicked problems is by bringing everybody together. And so Pillar's, founding principles was that the nonprofit sector would be that middle pillar, bring the other two together. And that's what we need to do in order to solve society's big problems. Yeah. We've just come through a horrible time with the pandemic, with lockdown. People are still recovering. The economy is still reeling. Everything that's going on right now in our economy can be traced back to the pandemic, the supply chain issues and all of that stuff. So, the nonprofit sector is still in recovery mode. We haven't returned to pre-pandemic levels for volunteering. Donating is way down. Volunteering is down, except not the food bank. you guys are an anomaly, and it's a testament to the hard work that you've done in bringing that strong support to the food bank. And I think that's just an amazing story, the story of the London Food Bank. But for others in the nonprofit sector, they're still reeling from what happened because of lockdown. Like, locking down our society had huge effects that are still rippling out in the nonprofit sector. We haven't made the effort to get our volunteers back because we're dealing with capacity issues on staff. So we used to have a central person that was responsible for coordinating volunteers at Pillar.
Yeah.
Because we don't have the capacity to fill that role, and the fact that people really aren't knocking on the door saying, I want to volunteer. It's sort of like a symbiotic thing. But we used to have a dozen volunteers at Pillar. We don't have those people anymore.
Yeah. When I look at the food sector, Maureen, and you know this as well as I do, I mean, it's when it comes to this nonprofit model or charitable model about distributing food to people that need it, I have noticed that since the pandemic ended, there's actually new groups that are starting up, because a lot of the older groups can no longer cover the base that they once did. It makes sense. Churches is a great example, or houses of faith. They lost a lot of their congregations during the pandemic because they weren't able to meet. And when they came back together, they still had all their plans and programs and everything else. They didn't have the people. They didn't have the volunteers. And it was really difficult. And it's interesting now for us as a food bank, we are now figuring out who is it that we are going to help. We've just increased our giving to other agencies in the community significantly, and we've let the public know that. But, I still think that one of the things that we all kind of lack is information, right? Like, if somebody I remember for years people would say, how many homeless are there? And it depended on who you asked. And even today, if you ask how many feeding programs are there out there, I'm not sure it could be answered accurately, but I do know that Pillar has announced, even at the AGM, that you're going to begin this data collection. And moving forward on that, I can only imagine that that's going to be of a valuable quality of help to groups like ours and others. How are you going to go about that?
So I'm lucky that I do have somebody here at Pillar that works directly with me. It's Paul Seal. He's our manager of public policy and advocacy, and we've really put a big emphasis on that role at Pillar. And it's partially my background is, coming from a government position, as an elected official. A big part of the role was developing policies for the City of London. And also a big part of a city councillor's role, if they're doing a good job, is advocacy as well, because the city, as you said, municipal governments are the least resourced level of government in the country. So a lot of the work is asking for money from the other levels of government. So an effective city councillor is a good advocate for that kind of funding. So working with Paul this summer, we were lucky as well to be supported by Huron University College. They're sending us a couple of students this summer, and one of them will work with Paul on this project. So they will spend this summer. We have access to data that's compiled nationally by Imagine Canada, in Ontario by the Ontario Nonprofit Network. We also we send out surveys regularly to our network and to our members just to gather data that way. Yeah. And we also partner with the Elgin London Middlesex Workforce Development Board. We participate in a survey that's quite broad, and we working with them, they can pull the data out specifically from the nonprofit sector, and we're really good at getting the word out to our network. So getting participation. The nonprofit sector is about 8% of GDP across the country. in this specific workforce survey that we partner with Elgin London Middlesex Workforce Development Board, they get 25% of the participation is from the nonprofit sector. So we're doing a really good job in getting that out there to our network and getting them to participate. So they have to get a better push out to the private sector so that the representation isn't skewed so much in the nonprofit favor. We like the data and we use the data, but so those are some of the ways that we're getting data, not just locally but across the country. And so the student that will be working with Paul over the summer will be compiling it all, crunching the numbers, doing what they need to do, probably sending out very targeted surveys as well over the summer months. And then in the fall, I'm guessing October, we hope to put on an event, and it was you that put the bug in my ear about this kind of event. So it will be a state of the sector kind of event. We will invite all the elected officials in town. We've had meetings with a number of MPs and MPPs the last couple of weeks because they weren't able to come to the AGM. And we've told them about this and that we would be inviting them. So we want to look at the parliamentary schedules to make sure we hit a week when they're all in town. And yeah, to sort of give the straight goods, good news and bad news. This is what's actually going on in London. Following that, the city will then go into their budget process and in the midst of that, the mayor will deliver his own State of the City address. So we want to be able to provide information and evidence and data up front that might help inform the city budget process for their budget update. So this will be their annual update that goes into their multi-year budget, and also inform whatever might possibly go into the mayor's State of the City address, because this will be part of the State of the City, what's happening in the nonprofit sector. So we're pretty excited about that, and our student that will be working directly with Paul, he joins us in May, a little bit later on in May, and then they'll get started on that right away.
Yeah. And then correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't it in late fall, November, December, that you're doing a big thing for Imagine Canada? Is that the same thing?
No, that will be after. So that's
after. So describe that to.
Yeah, that will be November that Magic Canada is doing their roadshow across the country. So they're coming to London, coming to Innovation Works in November.
Yeah, that's good. It's very, very much true that Pillar, I think, is so fundamental to all of this. Like our two organizations, the Food Bank and Pillar, have always had one another's backs. We're great, we really support one another, but we're not blind to the fact that what the Food Bank does is just distribute food, and that's it. What Pillar does is trying to bring together the whole sector, and that whole sector is exhausted.
Yeah,
they're just sagging. You can see it in them. They're feeling it. I'm sure your AGM was great. The people were positive at it, but then they go right back out into the service and having to do it. I mean, these are real heroes in the community. But is it your sense, Maureen? I mean, I know you're tired. I can tell. You can see it in me too. It is your sense that we're getting our head around this, or is it your sense that we're still kind of in the middle of it all, still calling out for change and other things, but we're still going to have to wait for a while for that to happen? Do you see any change leaking through?
If I can highlight one single policy push that we're making, that we're focusing our advocacy on with the provincial and federal representatives, it's the concept of a home in government. It's something that Imagine Canada has been pushing for a while. And so when we do our local delegations with our local MPs and MPPs, we talk about that. And so yes, there will be different nonprofits like London Intercommunity Health Center, which would connect pretty directly with the Ministry of Health. And then the food bank, you would have your specific ministries that you might deal directly with. But the concept of a home in government is somebody that will always be there, not necessarily to advocate for the nonprofit sector, but to understand the issues and the concerns and the challenges in the broad nonprofit sector. And then that minister might, or parliamentary assistant, however they want to set it up, that person might then also, collaborate with the Minister of Health if it's an issue related to health. But to always have that champion in government, that ministry, that staff that understand the broader sector and the needs and the implications. So it's just like going back to that city councilor that said, why should we invest in the nonprofit sector? Well, you already are investing in the nonprofit sector. So having a ministry that really understands what's been happening traditionally. So do we want to go back to the days when government did everything? I don't know if we ever were at those days where government did everything, but there definitely were times when government did more. So do you want to? There's pros and cons, and people might feel both ways, but do you want to build up your bureaucracy again and bring all that expertise in-house? I'm not sure if that is the most efficient way, given that there is a big infrastructure that is built. There is a lot of expertise out in the community. So yes, rely on that expertise, but stop thinking that you can get it for dirt cheap, because that's why the sector is tired, because people are working hard at, when we lose staff, they're taking a $20,000 at least pay raise. We can't compete with the academic sector for sure. We can't compete with the private sector. We can't compete with the government sector in wages and benefits and those kinds of things that they offer. So that's just staff alone. So you have a lot of people working really, really hard because they believe in the work that they're doing, but they can't work on belief alone indefinitely. They do have to think about their families and their futures, and they get tired and they get burned out and they leave the sector and they go somewhere else. One thing that is giving me hope is I sit on a few tables for the housing and homelessness whole of community system response, and the one table that really gives me heart is the workforce development table. These are the frontline workers at this table, but there's managers at this table, there's academics at this table, and they're talking about what the workforce needs to continue to do this work. So we hear some really sad stories, some difficult stories about what this workforce has been through. But to see the passion and dedication that they bring to their work is really inspiring. But again, they can't work like this forever. So this is a system, as you know, that's being built for the most part, from the bottom up. So they consulted with the people doing the work. They consulted with people who have been living on the streets or living precariously housed, and they've tried to build a system around what they learned from those people, the frontline workers, the people with lived and living experience. And they didn't do what they normally do. What they normally do is the province or the feds or both will come and they'll say, here's a few $1 million, build a system within those dollars. So they've done it backwards. They've said, what are the needs? Let's build a system around the needs. Then we'll come to a price tag. And hopefully, in an ideal world, we'll get funding that fits that price tag. So there is hope that we'll build something better than what has been built in the past, even if we can't get 100% to what needs have been identified. Hopefully, we'll get closer than we've ever been able to get in the past.
Yeah. Well, if we get there, it'll largely be due to you and Pillar. I mean, there are all these individual voices out there, but there's no voice. And we need that voice. And it's not the kind of thing the food bank can pull together because it's just in one sector. It's the kind of thing that Pillar could pull together. The need for a voice is more important than just allowing room for all of the voices, because we're living in real times of challenge.
Yeah.
We need to pull the communities together. I will say that I feel hope when I look at Pillar. That's the truth. I feel hope when I look at any group that's trying to draw voices together to make a voice.